Hello and welcome to Indus Special. I'm Meshal Malik. Now, over the past 2 days, countries all over the world went to Morocco to discuss the UN Global Compact for safe, orderly and regular migration. Now, this pact has had a lot of controversy surrounding it, as has the larger debate regarding migration. We'll discuss this further today with our guests. We have with us today Faraz Ghani, who is a journalist from Al Jazeera and who covered the conference in Morocco himself throughout. Thank you so much for joining us, Faraz.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
So, Faraz, can you tell us a little about the significance of this pact?
I think before we talk about the significance, I think we need to remember that even though this pact was agreed by 164 member nations, there was a lot of opposition and withdrawals in the lead up to the agreement, which was done on Monday. Also, the fact that this is actually a non-binding agreement, so countries are allowed to agree to it now, and then they can go back and they can change their minds later on if they wish. But in the lead up to the signing, it was really important that something needed to be done, because right now there's about 258 million migrants all over the world. This includes migrants who have left their country for economic reasons, for political reasons, for conflict, or just to get a better life abroad. So it was important that all these countries in the world, they come together, they sit down and talk about how to improve the situation for migration in the world and migrants in the world in order to provide them a safe, like the pact says, a safe, orderly and legal migration. Because a lot of them face issues not just during transit, but also when they reach a destination country. There's discrimination, there's harassment, there's all the kind of abuses and stuff they get. So it was really important that these countries come together, sit down and agree on a framework for something that needed to be done.
Faraz, you mentioned how this is legally non-binding. So coming from there, is there any practical significance of this pact?
I mean, yeah, there is practical significance, but again, the UN has always said, and it's in the pact as well, that this is legally non-binding, which means that countries, even though they agree to the framework, they agree to the pact. There's 23 points in the Global Compact for Migration, and it covers legal issues, it covers children, unaccompanied minors, it covers women, and also it covers things from how things are in the country of origin, during transit, in the country of destination. So it is something to be talked about. Again, what is going to happen is the countries who have agreed to it, they will now need to go back, speak to officials in their own country and adopt the pact according to their own national rules, laws and regulations. So something that a country has in accordance to its national laws, maybe for something that the neighboring country has. So, and then they're all allowed to pick and choose. They're allowed to opt out of the compact at a later date. So it's all kind of...
And they're also allowed to later on decide not to be a part of the compact.
Yes, they can. So the UN has made, again, I keep going back to the legally non-binding clause.
They can back out of it.
Compact. And as we saw, Brazil, which agreed to the compact in Marrakesh 2 days ago, there's going to be a change of government in January. And then the new foreign minister, he's already tweeted that once he takes power, once he's appointed, they're not going to agree, they're going to pull out of the compact because it's not, it's an inappropriate instrument to deal with the problem. That's what he said. So we've already seen that the day a country agreed to a compact, it was the same day that future foreign minister of that country said we're gonna pull out of it a month later when we come on air, so when we take office. So we will see. The UN is quite hopeful that the 29 countries who were not present at the conference in Morocco, some of them will come on board. But again, it's very up in the air right now. We don't know what the countries are going to decide once they go back. Some may join, some may opt out. But as things stand, 164 countries have agreed to it, so it's always a positive move going forward as things stand.
Faraz, can you tell us a little about some of the more definite outcomes of the conference?
I think there is no, that's the thing. It's because it's so up in the air, and because, again, I keep repeating this phrase, legally non-binding, there are no definite outcomes. The compact has been agreed in principle, but it will be formally endorsed by the UN in New York on December the 19th. That's when it formally takes shape. But this is not a signed agreement. There's no signatures. It's only an agreement, as they said. And again, for like the fourth or fifth time, I keep saying it's legally non-binding. So there are no definitive outcomes except that a framework has started. A framework has taken place. Talks have started. People are making some noise about the 258 million migrants in the world. As the politicians have realized that something needs to be done in order to improve not only the lives of these migrants, but also save the lives, because about 60,000 migrants have actually died in the last 18 years trying to go to a different country. And as they say, freedom of movement should not be restricted. And that's something that a lot of countries in the world have put restrictions on. And some of those countries were not present in Marrakesh to agree on the compacts.
Faraz, can you tell us a little about the environment during the conference? Was it tense since there was so much controversy surrounding it? Or were these leaders very, very optimistic about adopting this framework?
I think there was a lot of optimism. There was a lot of confidence in something good that was coming out of it. There was no tension because the countries that opted to withdraw, or the countries that didn't want to be part of it, or there were also some countries who said we need some more time discussing this. Those countries were not present in the conference. So when Antonio Guterres and Mr. Baroti, who was the president of the conference, he's the Moroccan foreign minister, when he presented the compact, the agreement to the floor, there was no objections, there was no opposition to it. It was all done and dusted pretty quickly. But again, like I said, this was just an agreement. The formal endorsement takes place on December the 19th in New York. So it was all, the countries who come to it, the countries who attended the conference, they were all in favor for it. So it was quite, there was a lot of optimism from the politicians, there was a lot of optimism from the NGOs, the human rights workers, there was Doctors Without Borders present, there was the Red Cross present, there was a lot of women in migration network. So everyone who had a stake in migrants and migration all over the world, they were all present, and they were all trying to convince the governments to take a more active role in the safe and orderly migration of these people. So it was full of optimism.
So what is the way forward from here now?
I guess the way forward is for all these NGOs, activists, organizations to keep the pressure on the government, because it's one thing agreeing to something in principle at a UN conference, but the more important thing is to not forget what was discussed, to not forget that there's the plight of these 258 million migrants all over the world. 80% of these migrants have experienced safe migration, but it's the 20%, especially in, say, Latin America, in the Middle East right now, with a lot of conflict and war, and especially on the African continent, there's a lot of difficulty with regards to people moving between countries. And that's something that we need to remind the governments of the conflict, of the reasons why these people leave their homes, because nobody would leave their home for no reason, right? So it's important that these people remember why they were in Marrakesh, and it's important that something comes out of this compact, and it's not just forgotten 5 years down the line. That's what the UN is stressing as well, that they want to keep up the pressure on these 164 countries and hopefully get more countries on their side in the next few months.
Faraz, that's my follow-up question there. So you mentioned Central America, and as we know, the US did not sign this agreement. So the UN is going to continue to try to put pressure on the countries that did not sign this pact.
I think I don't think the UN is in a position to put pressure, because the UN, as we all know, comprises of all these countries. And the US has a permanent seat on the Security Council. So the UN won't be able to pressure anyone, especially the US. So again, they've all said that this is according to it doesn't affect the sovereignty of a country. If a country doesn't want to join, it's up to them. If a country wants to join, they can adopt it according to their own laws and rules and regulations. So they won't be able to pressure anyone into joining this contact. Hopefully, it's the civil society that will be able to pressure the government. It's the civil society, the NGOs, the activists in all those countries, especially like you mentioned, Central America, Latin America, and obviously the United States. The civil society is very strong in there. I spoke to a lot of NGOs and civil society members in there, and they are hoping that there might be a shift in public attitude towards migration, be it from Central America, be it from South America, be it from Europe, be it from the Middle East. But again, the UN is not like, they won't be able to pressure anyone into joining there. They're just hopeful and optimistic that people will see the effects of this compact and will see how it can benefit their own economy and their own labor markets as well.
We're also joined with Omer Bilal Sufi, who is an international law expert. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Sufi, so with Faraz, we were talking about the controversy surrounding this conference and the fact that it's not legally binding, and there was still so much controversy surrounding it. Can you tell us a little about that?
Well, basically, any kind of a compact or a legal arrangement on immigration is bound to face controversy. And the reasons are because, on one hand, it is a competing interest between those countries who think that anyone who is seeking migration needs to be accommodated versus the set of countries which believe that you have no duty or obligation to accept people who are seeking migration under any garb of asylum or persecution. And it is the domain and the jurisdiction of the host country to make up its mind in exercise of its sovereign authority. So therefore, the likelihood of any document which attains such a binding instrument status is difficult in this area.
But it doesn't have a binding status at all. And in fact, the compact reaffirms the sovereignty of states. It mentions that countries are determined, that they can determine their own national migration policy.
I was about to say that. Actually, it is not binding in nature. So therefore, the fact that you question whether it should be binding or not doesn't arise, because it will be very difficult to have a binding status of this nature, because various countries are parties to various conventions which have again some opposite convention and obligation. So all this is saying is that we want the countries to be mindful of the concerns of those who are migrating and bring their policies in accordance with those obligations, that they are, whatever the legal space is available in their respective laws, they should allow that more favorably in favor of the migrants. But again, leaving that jurisdiction with the host states.
Mr. Sufi, now when we talk about migration, we talk of it as being a blanket term, but legally speaking, is there a distinction between voluntary migration and involuntary migration?
It is difficult to identify, but yes, in practice there is very clearly a well-maintained distinction. It has not been articulated in a convention form right now in a very thorough fashion. For example, voluntary migration would be where people want to migrate to another country. They apply for the formal process. They apply through the government channels. They seek migration on the ground of going for better grounds, for job opportunities. So that's a voluntary process. Involuntary is where people end up themselves because they believe they need to be there. But that is also overlapping with an obligation, which is the law of refugee, law of asylum seeking, and that's where it creates more problems.
So, okay, taking it on from there, when refugees are trying to seek asylum, can you tell us about certain legalities in place to screen them? Because host countries often come up with these apprehensions that since these asylum seekers are coming without paperwork, how can you identify those with credible backgrounds?
That's true. That is a concern, because every person who claims to be a refugee may not be successfully qualifying the standards of an asylum seeker. Asylum is a long-term protection given by the host state where the person arrives. And normally it is based on several considerations. And one consideration of if he is sent back to his country of origin, he could be persecuted or could be facing serious political persecution. To make that determination, you have to administratively detain the person who is seeking asylum or allow him restricted movements in your country till you make up his mind, till you make up your own mind through independent sources about the nature of the person. Now, there could be another 2 or 3 different practitioners' realities to it. One is where individuals come, the country from where he is coming is otherwise a normal country. It is not undergoing a war. It is not undergoing any internal conflict. But this particular person flies off and lands and says, well, I am being persecuted by the police of a particular country, so please give me asylum, and I want to seek a refuge. Now, that is one issue. The other is where a country is torn, there is a political violence, there is a military violence, something like Afghanistan, where people fled in large numbers for survival purposes. So their legal treatment is slightly different, and it has to be measured against different legal standards. Normally, for that, you have refugee conventions. For individuals who take off from one country to another, you normally have what we call the asylum-seeking laws of every country, which vary from one country to another.
For us, I want to ask you in relation to this point, Mr. Sufi mentioned that did this conference talk about the laws in terms of refugee seekers and asylum seekers, and did it make a distinction between involuntary migration and voluntary migration?
No, there was no distinction, but I think one thing we need to remember that this conference was not about refugees alone. It was about migrants. The migration numbers are far, far bigger than the refugee numbers. So we're not talking just about people who had to flee because of conflict, because of war. We're also talking about economic migrants. So someone who's leaving a country because of better work opportunities, because of better future. So we're talking about a big, big number. We're talking about 258 million migrants in the world as opposed to 23 million something refugees that exist in the world right now.
16.2 million refugees, I believe, the UN estimated in 2017 from these 258 million migrants.
Yeah. So the point I'm trying to make is we're talking about a much, much, much bigger number. With regards to the voluntary and involuntary migration, there was no distinction made because, again, someone could migrate because he or she needs to find a better job. Someone could migrate in search of a better future for the kids, for a different nationality to make life easier. So there was no distinction made in there. And again, like I said earlier, 80% of these migrants that exist right now have experienced safe and orderly migration. It's the 20% that experience discrimination, abuse, racism, not just in transit, but also in the country of destination. That's the bigger concern for the UN and also all the NGOs and stuff. So all in all, we're talking about all the migrants in the world, be it working in a multinational company in a different country, or if you're fleeing poverty or instability, political instability, or you're fleeing climate change or any of those reasons. So we're talking everybody, not just the voluntary migrants.
For us, but even when they were talking about every sort of migrant during this conference, was there any priority given to refugees during the discussions?
No, there wasn't. The thing is, again, refugee laws differ from country to country, and again, I'm no legal expert in this subject, but it depends on each and every country how they classify refugees, how they assign asylum seeker status. So, say when I was in Korea earlier this year to do some refugee stories, they had a different refugee policy, and I was in Morocco earlier this year as well doing some African migrant story, and they don't even have an asylum policy. So it's just on an ad hoc basis. They came up with a policy 4 years ago whereby they gave residency permits to 50,000 migrants. So again, it depends on country to country. It depends on the jurisdiction. It depends on the laws that the country has. So again, the UN cannot enforce a country to bend its laws to accommodate the refugees. It can only pressure some countries to take in more refugees, if possible, depending on the economic and political condition. But again, there is no emphasis as such made just on refugees.
Thank you so much, Faraz, for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you. Let's move on to discussing this issue with Mr. Sufi further. Mr. Sufi, I'd like to move on to welfare states. You mentioned, and Faraz mentioned, that the laws vary from country to country. But what about welfare states where there is so much apprehensions regarding in the host country that migrants are coming and they're burdening the welfare state? What are the legalities involved in this?
Well, more than legality, it's a political issue here. Because if a country begins to believe that migrants are creating burden on their economy, that remains a reality, but then you still have a legal basis to give treatment to them. Because once they are in your jurisdiction, on your territory, you have a duty to look after them. Because the fundamental right to dignity, right to home, right of privacy is not only a right of your national, but also the right of anyone who is residing on your territory. So you need to ensure that. And that translates into social welfare burden for the host state. And that is a political question, how far it wishes to take this burden and how far it wishes to proceed with it. If it thinks that person who is seeking migration on a voluntary or involuntary basis is of use to the state, his expertise, his skill set, or his any other kind of resource which he offers as an individual, or his expertise could be of use to the state, and it is worth paying him the welfare benefits, then that balance can be struck. But where that state maintains or believes that here is a person who is going to become a burden, is old, is carrying a family with too many children, and will be a drain on the welfare resource of the state, and state can take a political decision in terms of altering its immigration laws. And normally, whenever it tries to do that, the people who are seeking immigration do also retain the right to challenge and question that in the jurisdiction of that state, in their courts, in their administrative tribunals. And we see very often any change of immigration policy being questioned and challenged in the domestic courts of these states. But that is where things are in terms of the political choice versus the legal basis.
We're going to discuss this issue further after a short break. Stay with us. Hello and welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing the migration issue further, and now we're joined with Peter Kleppe, who is the head of Brussels office of Open Europe. Thank you so much, Peter, for joining us.
My pleasure.
So, Peter, has this UN migration pact divided Europe even further?
Yes, I think you can say that. France and Germany and the UK are in favor, but countries like Austria, like Hungary, like Poland, they are against. Countries like Switzerland, Italy also rather against. There's some unclarity there. And I think indeed, especially in Belgium, my own country, it has led to very deep divisions and the fall of the government.
So what is expected from the fall, with the fall of the government? What can we expect next in Belgium?
In Belgium, there's going to be elections anyway in May of this year. So likely the current government is going to stumble on as some kind of a minority caretaker government that's going to be more or less like a lame duck. And then we will have elections.
Now, Hungary's spokesperson stated that the reason they pulled out was because the pact is trying to make migration a human right issue. And if nations take a closer look, that is opening up Pandora's box. What are your thoughts on that, Peter?
There's a frustration in Europe that a lot of choices related to migration have not been made by politicians, but have been made by judges, taking all kinds of interpretations, sometimes controversial interpretations of human rights treaties that were agreed after the Second World War. This has been dubbed judicial activism. So that is one of the reasons why many politicians in Europe now are maybe sometimes a bit hysterically warning about this migration pact. And you have very extreme positions. You have people on the one side that say, no, this is a non-binding document. It contains all kinds of things. and you have other people who say that any clause can be interpreted to mean anything really. For example, there's a clause saying that family reunification for migrants should be made easier, and that's really throwing up a lot of concerns, because it's precisely family reunification that has served as one reason why it has been difficult sometimes for people from outside of Europe to integrate in European countries.
Can you tell us a little about the political play at the backhand regarding migration in Europe at this moment? Now we see that the right wing is rising, and they are using the sphere of migration as a tool to basically put forth their agenda. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure. I mean, it's very important to make a distinction between migration and whether there's control over it. I think Europeans, by and large, are not against migration. I mean, everyone has friends in other countries. Everyone has traveled a lot. People understand that in today's globalized world, it's completely nonsense to close the borders completely. But the real debate is about control. And people really are asking themselves, and I would dare to say a majority of Europeans, a majority of Westerners, is there enough control over our borders? If we make certain choices on migration policy, will these choices be respected? Because otherwise, what's the point of making choices? What's the point of telling people to wait in line, go to very difficult procedures, and when it's not possible to control the borders, and people who don't respect these procedures can just arrive? So I think that's really the key challenge. Now, in 2015, 2016, we've seen a very great inflow of people entering Europe in an irregular manner. It's not necessarily illegal, but it's definitely in an irregular manner. This also has to do with the hypocrisy of European asylum law, whereby you can only apply for asylum once you have arrived in Europe. So there's many problems. I think what really should happen is that Europe should have something like an Ellis Island. Ellis Island was the island ahead of New York, where migrants first were, for example, medically checked, where they were interrogated before they could enter the American mainland. So I think we need something similar. I think asylum seekers should simply await their asylum request before they can enter European territory. At the moment, if you manage to reach European territory, you can just travel on freely. And in theory, you're supposed to file an asylum request, but many people simply don't do that. So this, of course, gives a terrible incentive for people to risk their lives. That's why we've seen so many people dying at sea. I think almost 20,000 over the last 10 years or so in the Mediterranean Sea. This is a real shame for Europe. This is a tragedy. And what we've seen in other countries, in Australia particularly, but also actually in Greece, but not many people realize, is that when you tell people you can apply for asylum, but you can only travel on after you have been given a positive asylum request, that the number of people risking their lives drops to almost zero, which is a good thing. Of course, then it happens in an orderly manner. So that's step number one. Of course, if we implement that, many people will be denied asylum. So then the question is, what do we do with these people? Now, what I've proposed personally is to really try to provide a perspective to the people that are denied entry in Europe as well. And there's many good reasons to leave your country. So I would never hold that against someone. And so I think it could be great if Western countries together would develop refugee cities where they could welcome everyone, really, everyone that would be looking for a better life. And we have a great precedent for that. Hong Kong was not only a British colony, but it was also a safe haven for many refugees back in the days from communist China. Now, if the British could do that 60, 70 years ago, I'm sure that the whole of the developed world could be able to build
Peter,
a number of cities like that where we could welcome those seeking a better life.
Peter, but in this case, when you're talking about refugee cities, wouldn't that imply that you're just alienating these refugees further and you're preventing them from assimilating into a normal world?
Let me be very clear. I think we should still have migration and asylum, of course, but I was talking about the solution for the people that are denied asylum, economic migrants, right? So at the moment, even the greatest proponents of asylum policy, people that would like to have 3 times as many asylum seekers entering the West, they are not in favor of letting these people come to European countries. So I'm really thereby giving a solution for people whose only alternative at the moment is to either sneak in illegally and risk their lives and end up in the hands of human smugglers and mafia groups and organized crime. So I think this would be really something that would give a great perspective for people that are economic migrants, and there's nothing wrong with being an economic migrant. It's actually, it's a very ambitious thing to be. So I think we have the means, we have the resources, we have the capabilities in European countries to develop such cities. And to respond to your point, this absolutely does not mean that we should no longer grant asylum. We should also, of course, grant asylum to those prosecuted. And I think what you see is, at least in Australia, when you manage to control your border, that people, public opinion becomes much more positive about welcoming asylum seekers. Australia is welcoming many, many refugees at the moment, but it all happens in an orderly manner.
Stay with us. We're going to discuss this further. We just have to go for a short break. Hello and welcome back to Indus Special. We're in conversation with Peter Kleppe, and we are also joined with Mr. Asif Munir, who is a migration and displacement analyst. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Munir.
Thank you.
Mr. Munir, before going to break, Peter made a really interesting comment about creating refugee cities in Europe in order to ensure that those refugees that do not are not granted asylum, they have a place to go. What is your opinion about that?
Well, I think the global politics dominates the discussion on migration and refugees, so that's very true. And especially how it's impacting the Western world and in particular Europe. This issue of global compact on migration came about with the recent phenomena of the refugee situation. Now, of course, there is the issue of asylum seeking and how the process goes, but then it's also an issue whether which gets priority, how things are prioritized, and how the political leaders play a role in that, how they pull out of certain discussions, and how things dominate. The issue of refugees, of course, has been an issue for a long time. But why is it in discussion right now, more so than ever? It's because of the changes and how it has impacted, especially Europe.
Peter, I'd like to go back to European laws a little bit. And could you tell us a little about the Dublin regulation and what are the controversies and problems surrounding it?
Well, the Dublin regulation simply dictates that migrants need to apply for asylum in the first country of arrival, the first safe country of arrival. And of course, as a result of that, when you have a crisis in the Middle East, the European countries that will face the biggest burden are the countries closest to the Middle East. So those are Italy and Greece. As a result, these countries have asked that this regulation would somehow be changed, but I think it's very hard to change that because, you would have to tell people to apply for asylum somewhere else. The question is, how can you force people to actually do that? Simply because within Europe, there is the so-called Schengen area, which means that people can cross borders without having to show their passport, without having to show their ID. And this is a great achievement of European unification. Now, if you would tell somebody, hey, you have to apply for asylum in Denmark and you have to apply for asylum in Portugal, I mean, it's very hard to spread people. So physically, that's not possible. That's why also changing the Dublin regulation is not possible. So this is all a political show for governments that want to be seen to be doing something, especially the Italian government, and also the current Italian government continues to request this. But I don't think it's physically possible to implement spreading of refugees, spreading of asylum requests. It's not going to happen.
But but according to European Union, states have a liability to help those countries in which there is an influx of asylum seekers, especially Italy and Greece.
No, I mean, of course, the moral argument is there. It's clear that we need to help countries that are struggling to cope with the great influx of refugees. But the question is, can you physically tell people to go somewhere? And the European Union already has some schemes to try to tell people to go to certain countries. But what we see is that when people are told to go to Portugal, most of them leave Portugal. When people are told to go to the Baltics, people leave these countries because there's not so many well-paid jobs over there, and typically they also don't have family or friends, or not at least as many as they have in countries like Germany. So it's completely normal if you're a migrant that you propose that you try to go to countries where you can develop your future. So a lot of energy has been wasted on this. Actually, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, she has created a lot of anti-EU sentiment by proposing methods to force countries to accept migrants. And every country in the world, I think, migration is a very sensitive topic. It's already very hard for national politicians that are democratically elected to convince the population of welcoming migrants or large numbers of them. But it's, of course, almost impossible for supranational bureaucrats to tell democracies to do that. So this is definitely something that is very touchy. And as I mentioned, because you have no passports, it is not possible to implement in practice. What needs to happen is to try to guard the external border of Europe, the sea border. In Belgium, we don't have a border with the Mediterranean Sea, but nevertheless, our border is the Mediterranean Sea, simply because Europe is so unified that it's very simple to go from the one country to the other. So we need to help a country like Italy with border protection. I don't think we need a European border protection, but we need to create a space where people can await their asylum request. So when the Italian Coast Guard arrest people that are entering in irregular manner into Italy, these people can be transferred to a safe place where they can apply for asylum. When they get a yes, they should be welcomed in Europe. When they get a no, they should be transferred back. Or that's why
Peter, let's bring Mr. Munir into the conversation as well. Mr. Munir, we see how there are hostile sentiments all across Europe, the United States against immigrants. Can you tell us a little about why economic migrants are still wanting to move to these places?
Yeah, well, it's not just economic migrants. I mean, there's the whole mix of, the mixed migration. That's the term being used recently. It's also like different needs and, situations, not just, situations of conflict, other issues as well. It's also the changing pattern of the global economic patterns in the last 10, 15 years as well. Now, yes, there has been always a trend to move towards certain countries for a better life or better income. Now, recent years we have seen in terms of, I would say, in terms of the politics and also in terms of the citizen power. And this term about xenophobia, I mean, there's been certain rise in certain places, certain countries, where there's a government or very reactionary government, including the United States. So that has had an impact on, both people's perception, but also the government position towards immigrants. But I would say that the issue of immigrants had been there always, but there has been a change in the political forces that come into power, and that has had an impact. Of course, there has been a global phenomenon, particularly the Syrian refugees, but also the other things that these were there for quite some time. But now it's a different scenario because of, kind of right-wing rise of the right-wing political parties.
Mr. Munir, now we talk a lot about how countries, their sovereignty must be respected. But in this manner, how do we reconcile the global need to resolve the migration crisis, or at least address it, while respecting each country's sovereignty?
Yeah, I think one of the sort of vision for the Global Compact was that to resolve the current dynamics of migration. But unfortunately, maybe it's going to be another instrument which doesn't really work. Now, yes, there has to be a balance in terms of the sovereignty, but also the national security, and also the issue of people's right to move and mobility and right to seek asylum or, migrate. I'm just going to cite that in terms of the Rohingya refugees who had come into Bangladesh, had to because they were forced. Within Bangladesh, there was sort of a debate, especially last year when there was this huge influx, that it's going to affect the national security and issue of rise of religious extremism and all that. But I would say that it was not well-founded, and there hasn't been any kind of backlash in that sense, which is, it's the largest refugee population in anywhere in the world. There was this speculation, and it did not happen, and it's not going to happen. That's what we feel from an analytical point of view. So there is this issue of xenophobia that, the migrants do dominate in terms of, the national security. Yes, of course, there are some elements, but, it's not well-founded. So there needs to be a balance in terms of, real evidence, in terms of, maybe research, looking at what does the immigrant or migrants contributing to the country, whether good or bad. That has not been sort of a balanced kind of analysis yet.
Peter, what does this pact mean for the Syrian refugees, the Rohingya refugees, and all these refugees across the world? Is this good news?
The pact is, I think not really going to change much. I think the people who are against it, they exaggerate a little bit. But it's really business as usual. It should be called the business as usual pact. I mean, there's everything in it that you can find about opinions about migration. And there's some elements about countries having to take back their nationals. There's some elements about countries having to promote migration and to make family reunification more easy. But the key thing it does not, I think, and that's the problem, is that it does not call for safe spaces where asylum seekers can await their asylum request. And you need such a safe space. The European Union has decided to create something like that. It has not actually implemented it, but in June it has decided to do that. And you need such a safe space to be able to have an orderly border protection, because the problem is not so much that border guards do not see the people pouring in. It's kind of hard to miss them when 10,000 per day enter, but it's the problem is that when people enter the territory in an irregular manner, that they can just continue their journey, and this gives an incentive for people to risk their lives. This helps human smuggling. The organized crime groups make fortunes at the moment thanks to this, and the Migration Pact does nothing to deal with that. The Migration Pact also doesn't even consider this idea of refugee cities, which I think could be a great idea to fundamentally help all the people that will be denied for a right or a wrong reason, because we can have a long discussion about whether there should be completely open migration or not. But the fact of the matter is that in any country in the world, a large majority of the population is against completely open borders. Now, at the other hand, we have many people that, for many good reasons, want to leave their country. So, what industrialized countries, what the West could do, is to try to replicate its rule of law protection somewhere else. And as I mentioned, this has happened before in Hong Kong. And some other places. Well, you have many new cities popping up around the globe. So technically, that's not a problem. I think big companies would be very interested to invest there if they would know it's safe, if they would know it's happening under the guidance of countries
Peter,
with the highest
I'd like to explore the issue of repatriation a little more, and I'll take this question to Mr. Munir before we end the show. Mr. Munir, one of the objectives mentioned in the pact was cooperate in facilitating safe and dignified return and readmission, as well as a sustainable reintegration of refugees. So can you tell us a little about that? Do you think that the repatriation process will change at all after this pact?
Yeah, well, readmission is another area. It's a readmission, whether, in terms of the destination country as well. But in terms of return and reintegration into their home countries, it's a question of, does the situation prevail in terms of the reasons for leaving the country? Now, if a person had to leave a country because of conflict, or whether their life was at risk or rights being violated in an extreme manner, whether that has been reversed, and that would have, a implication for decision-making for a person. So that is slightly, of course, different than the issue of economic migrants. A person who is forced to leave the country is also kind of forced to stay out if there is no significant change in the country of origin. Now, there is the question of third country resettlement, and that has not been very popular yet. Some countries had experimented with that, but it has not sort of gained ground too much. But in terms of countries where there is, the democratic the demographic dividend is slightly, favorable for allowing foreigners or other people to have some kind of that can be another option in terms of not just return and integration, but a third country resettlement.
Thank you so much, Mr. Asif, for joining us, Peter Kleppe for joining us. It was very great talking to you, and it was a pleasure having you guys on the show. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We hope to see you again next week.